Hello and welcome to our sixth in the series of rare webinars. Today we're talking about all things gene therapy as we look to learn more about the untapped potential and respective challenges that may lay ahead. I'm Nicola Miller, the Creative Director at Rare Revolution magazine, and in the background, working on the tech, I'm joined by my colleague Becky Pender. Today's session is sponsored by CSL Behring, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by a really full and very knowledgeable panel. Jefferson Courtney, Policy and Public Affairs Manager at the Haemophilia Society, Samantha Barber, CEO at Gene People Charity, Nicola Redfern, Independent Consultant at NJ Redfern Limited, who collaborate with a number of industry partners, including our sponsor today, Matthew Durdy, CEO at Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult, Sheila Upadhyaya, an Independent Life Sciences Consultant specialising in rare diseases, and Dan Betts, Head of Marketing Access for UK and Ireland at CSL Behring. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Now we've got a huge amount to get through in the next hour and a half, so we're going to dive straight in. I think it's really important that we get back to basics and set the scene for our listeners who may be new to the concept of gene therapy. So Matthew, if I can come to you first, can you just tell us a bit about what are gene therapies and why are people so excited about them?
Gene therapies are medical interventions that aim to change the genetic information of an individual in order to induce some sort of therapeutic outcome. That involves potentially the addition, substitution, correction, or removal of DNA within the patient. Now, why is that an exciting concept? Well, I think that at multiple levels, but primarily because of the promise and that it offers to treat patients in the future who currently do not have treatment options available to them. And that's all subject to quite a lot of work in order to get there. But also it offers the potential to treat patients who do have some treatment options available to them in a different way, in a way that aims to produce an enduring outcome that means that the patients have a better overall life and perhaps have less requirement for medical intervention and less complications. And I think it's fair to say there is another reason why there is excitement around this, which is both positive and misunderstood, which is they tend to be a single point in time or a concentrated point in time when the intervention takes place. And that means that there is this enduring change from a single point in time, but also a concentration of cost associated with affecting the treatment as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Matthew. And to understand the unmet needs that gene therapy seeks to address, Sam, can you give us an insight into the impact of rare diseases on the health system and on patients and families?
So thank you for inviting me here today. It's really interesting because one of the themes that, I'm going to deviate from your question just for a moment. One of the things that always comes up when we're talking in situations like this, webinars, roundtables and conferences, is particularly around rare diseases, is promise, or as I would call it, hope. And I think that's what gene therapies, and Matthew had absolutely hit it on the head, that's what gene therapies gives the community, that hope for the future, that promise for improved lives. But I'm an English student back in the day, and so you always start with a context. And there's approximately 3.5 million people living with a rare disease in the UK. 95% of rare conditions do not have a treatment. That's 95%. I'm an optimist. I usually say 5% of conditions have a treatment. And I think that glosses over the fact that 95%, that's a big number of conditions do not have a treatment. That's a huge unmet need, a huge opportunity. I think if we stop thinking about it as unmet need, but as an opportunity for that excitement, that exploration, that innovation. And for us at Gene People, roughly between 70 to 80% of rare conditions are genetic, whether they're inherited or de novo. So it's quite an interesting area, this area for us of gene therapy, because it could impact quite a number of people with rare conditions. And that's where the overlap comes from. I think that's really important to remember. That's why this is such a hot topic for the rare disease community. I think that just that quantum, that 3.5 million people, is quite an impact on the health system, because individually rare conditions are rare, that's why they're rare, but cumulatively that 3.5 million is a big number that's going to have some impact on the health and social care system. We mustn't forget that there's social care in there too. And in terms of patients, well, there are so many conditions, you know, between 10,000 and 11,000 is the current figure being talked about. So that's, again, it's a multitude of different conditions, all presenting in different ways, all having different impacts. And many of those conditions themselves are spectrum conditions. So you could be very, almost not know that you have a rare condition, or you could be devastatingly affected, depending where you are on that spectrum. So the impact on patients is wide and varied. And I was thinking about this for something else the other day. I do a lot of thinking in the middle of the night, as you do. And I was thinking, really, if you really wanted to know the impact of rare diseases, you would need to speak to every single person who had one and their family.
Yeah.
And I think I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Straight out the gate and already, you know, absolutely on point. And context is everything. And I think 3 things in particular you said there, which is with hope, which of course is so important, and that flipping that narrative of actually 95% without a treatment, you know, that's huge. And also social care, I think really important to bring that out when we're thinking about healthcare systems, what a vital component that is. Jeff, can I come to you with the same question? Is there anything you'd like to add to Sam's kind of context there?
Yes, yeah. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this session today. I think really the challenge with rare diseases is exactly as Sam said, that there are so many of them and they impact people in such different ways. Our experience is obviously many people often have a very long journey towards diagnosis for their condition, and you know they may be navigating through a primary care system before eventually getting referral into secondary care. And then obviously the challenge that Sam mentioned, that you know, not all these conditions have good treatment options available to them. I'd like to dwell a little bit though on the 5% of conditions that do have treatment options, because I think that has a very big impact on the health system as well, you know, particularly in our space in bleeding disorders. So you have all those challenges that Sam talks about, like kind of those challenges of diagnosis and getting referral. But ultimately, once you get there, you end up with a series of conditions that do have treatment options, but can be very expensive and require a very, very different kind of care to what's normally expected from the system. So for example, in haemophilia, there need to be dedicated haemophilia centres across the country that they need to kind of understand that condition well. They need to have a very wide multidisciplinary team of people that aren't just treating the condition itself, but the other things that go with it. So for example, we're having, you know, physiotherapists, obstetricians and gynecologists, a dedicated lab team that understand how to care for this, specialized nursing, specialized consultants, and all that comes with quite a high cost. I think really the challenge is demonstrating that actually it's important for the health system to provide that care when any individual rare disease affects a relatively small proportion of the population. So I think it's kind of dependent on us to make that case, to keep finding new treatments for those other 95%, but also to keep making that case that these diseases are important and that people need to get that care that they need for these conditions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff. Sheila, would you like to add anything to that, wearing your kind of hat and perspective on this?
Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, I mean, all really important things. I started my career in the NHS and I was lucky enough to start in rare diseases, commissioning some of these rare disease services that have just been described. And, you know, I think we can't underestimate the impact that a rare disease has on a patient and family, as both Jeff and Sam have described. You know, this is not just about a patient who has a condition, the whole family have to get involved. You know, the stress, the anxiety, the whole kind of nightmare of not getting a diagnosis and then getting one and then finding either that there's no treatment available or the ones that aren't accessible for in some shape or form because the infrastructure isn't available for you to access it quickly. And that kind of leads me on to some of the challenges that healthcare professionals and the health system has. So as Jeff has described, you know, the need to have multidisciplinary care in rare diseases is much more magnified than it would be for, say, a diabetes patient. And so the need for the health service to be able to organise the right multidisciplinary team at the right time, and ensure that those experts are knowledgeable enough, in rare diseases is really challenging. And no disrespect to any healthcare professional that might be listening, but there are healthcare professionals in the kind of general healthcare system who can't even pronounce the condition, let alone treat it. So I think it's really important to be cognizant of the fact that, as Sam and Jeff have said, rare diseases are small, but collectively they're big. There is a need for the healthcare system to also understand that the needs of rare disease patients are so much more complex than they are for a regular kind of more prevalent condition that needs support. And I think the other challenge that the healthcare system has to deal with in the rare disease space is when you've got specialized centers. Well, how do patients get there? If it's 200 miles away, it's really, really difficult when you've got a child who has a rare condition, but you also have other children. And guess what? We also have, or trying to hold down jobs. So I think, the complexity around a family who has to deal with one or maybe more patients, if it's an inherited condition, with these conditions, with a rare disease is really huge. But the healthcare system is also equally challenged in trying to organise these services in a way that supports patients and families and enables the healthcare system to deliver a really efficient and effective service. So that's a lot for people to think about. But yeah, it's not as easy as it sounds.
It's clear there's some complex issues and challenges ahead. So it's important to think through both the kind of all sides of innovation to really present a balanced discussion. So Nicola, what are the potential impacts, positive and negative, please, that might be associated with new therapies such as gene therapy or innovations in the rare disease space?
It's a really good question, and I think it's really, really complex, because every single gene therapy or cell therapy that's coming through the system for every single disease is subtly different. So there's lessons we can learn as we evolve, but actually we need to look at everything in individuality. So it is a really complex space. I think from my perspective, back to what Matthew was saying, this is really sexy science. And I was thinking about an Alice in Wonderland quote this morning that I have on my wall, which talks about people want magical solutions to their problems, but most people don't actually believe in magic. And I guess that's kind of where I see us at the moment in the gene therapy world, where we potentially have got that magical solution starting to evolve. We're looking at treatments that potentially could be curative, or if not, extend life expectancy and or significantly improve quality of life, not only for the people living with the condition, but their families and their friends and their work environment. So it's got huge positive ramifications. But today, I think we're really cautious still about our level of belief in that data as it's starting to evolve. So yes, there's uncertainty around the data sets. It might be small patient numbers because of the rarity of the condition. It may be that we've only got data that is 3, 4, 5, perhaps even 10 years out, which is not any different from any other treatment that is launched into a market. We have gaps, we have uncertainty, we have questions. But when payers and decision makers are looking at these things, that uncertainty seems to be overpronounced from my perspective. And people are very, very cautious, which is then inhibiting the speed at which these things are actually becoming available for patients and families to make a choice about. And I think, for me, and I'd be interested in other people's perspectives, but this should be about choice. We talk about patient empowerment and where decision making should be. We really, I personally really respect the regulators because they review things from a safety and clinical effectiveness perspective, and we wouldn't want to take that away. I'm a taxpayer, so we don't want to take away the cost effectiveness and value discussions that are really, really important that NICE and NHS England are a part of. But at the same time, we don't want to be too cautious, because almost there's a break in the system, a natural break in the system, which is the patient and the family and the people living with the condition, who then make up their own minds as to whether they want to take that risk and make that choice. And personally, I'm really, really excited, having been in the space for 6 years. And I think we've got some brilliant minds and some fantastic opportunity, especially in the UK, but across Europe, to make sure these things actually reach clinic. But it feels a little bit slow and clunky at the moment, and as if we've not fully looked at it holistically to actually say, how do we do this well as a UK, entity, holistically across different stakeholders? How do we do it well? How do we do it quicker? And how do we actually empower patients to make those choices once the data is available?
And it sounds like a little bit of what you're saying as well is that some of that is down to inherent sort of reticence or nervousness about the process, that you said about that, you believe in the magic, that kind of natural inhibition that we all have about taking that leap. So it's kind of finding ways to bring everybody on that journey of the sexy science and understanding what it really is, what it means, what the limitations are, what the potential are, and kind of having faith in that data and what's emerging from it.
I think it's really difficult, because unless you're really informed about the disease itself, which often only specialists and the families are, and you really understand the promise of the science, and those people who really seem to understand the promise of the science, and it's a shame we haven't got our clinician on board in this call at the moment, but it's very difficult for the rest of us as non-scientists to really have that same level of faith. And yet those people often aren't involved into decision-making circles and don't sit on the panels that ultimately come to conclusions. And it just feels like there's a mismatch. So I'd be interested in Matthew and Sheila's perspectives on it, having sat in different spaces.
It's just an observation, as with all new innovations, and this is not just something around the life sciences industry, but even if you take the technology industry, iPhones and stuff, when these new innovations came to light, I think everyone was really nervous about them, and it took time for people to kind of adjust and accept and acknowledge, and I think for me, gene therapies and this kind of innovative space is the same. These things come out much quicker than the system can kind of catch up and be able to, be in a position to be able to respond to them and do the right thing. So I think what Nicola's saying is extremely valuable, that we need expertise to guide us and build that confidence in all of us. All of the stakeholders need to build that, but that often takes time, and each stakeholder, unfortunately, some stakeholders can take a little bit longer than others to kind of get with the program, so to speak. So I wonder if in the gene therapy space we're in a similar situation. It's all new and it's all shiny, and some people are really quick to adopt it and want to use it, and some people are thinking, oh, I don't really know what happens if I press that button, and that's kind of the kind of environment that we might be in, and we need to kind of find a way of bringing people onto the same page.
Does that resonate with you, Matthew? Is that?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that we can do at this stage in the development of the science, if you like, is have dialogues like the one we're having here, is to share information and make sure that we have the right balance between reality and expectation. There is enormous promise. There's also enormous amounts of work to do, and everybody has to work together on it. And we need to manage expectations for patients. We also need to manage expectations with the healthcare system and government, because if we promise too much and we don't deliver it in time, then they'll back away and won't follow through with the resources that we need to do it. And I think there's something else that I wanted to bring in, and I'm going to use this opportunity to bring it in, is we talk a lot about rare disease. From my perspective, there are some differences clearly between rare disease and more prevalent diseases, But one of the most important things that gets understated, I think, with respect to the potential of gene therapy in rare disease is that everything that we learn in the rare disease space, we may be able to take on to more prevalent indications as well. And the way that we develop our capabilities with respect to the delivery of gene therapies will also have a knock-on effect to other areas as well. So as we get more proficient in delivery, more economic in terms of manufacturing capability, we are developing an industry that has application and patient benefit way beyond the benefits that come to rare diseases as well.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. And Sam, obviously you very much see this from the patient and family perspective for the work you do in supporting families who gene people. What potential impact, negative and positive, do you see for families?
I think some of the things that we see have already been touched on, that hope that there will be something for them and their loved one and their particular condition, frustration when there isn't, frustration at sometimes the speed of access, which is why clinical trials are so important to those with rare conditions, because that's an early access point. And also it's that expectation management. What is it actually going to do? How is it going to modify the condition? What does it actually mean in real terms? And sometimes we see a bit of disconnect. Sometimes patients really want this and maybe it happens like that over there instead. And it's a very interesting field to be in because of that complexity and because of that the expectations. I think as well, in terms of challenges, it is a choice. Nikki's very correct about that. And we have seen sometimes where there is a treatment coming along and people have said, well, do I have to take it? What will my friends in this community think of me if I don't?
Yeah.
And that's a really hard one, because as Sheila was speaking, I was trying to remember there is an actual model, isn't it, that where the early adopters come along and then you have a little bit of a trough and then you get and I can't remember the next bit. I can only remember early adopters, but sometimes when you're in that early, the early adopters are early. That's why they're called early adopters, and they'll go for the clinical trials and they do all those kinds of things, and then it starts to be mainstreamed, and actually you might have a little bit of a dip off before it picks up again. And I think it's personal choice. It's what you want for your loved one, for your family. And I think also, as everyone was talking, something that came through, which is potentially a challenge not only for those with rare conditions, but we're now thinking about more access to gene testing, to genetic testing. And with that, there has to be a big raft of education, of public education. And that runs alongside the system readiness that we've been talking about as well, because I think it will become an even greater challenge if people don't understand gene therapies in the same way as they understand treatments for cancer, perhaps.
Absolutely. Well, two really important things you said there is circling back to that, it's individuality. I think Nicola used the word, and it's that having options and accepting that everybody's burden and everybody's situation is different. So, that pressure isn't there, that, we can really look at it individually, and also the importance of education in that piece of taking people on the journey of what this is and what it isn't. Jeff, how is this viewed from your community perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I think I wanted to kind of build on Sam's point around the individual decision-making aspect of it, because I think actually that's actually a very complex situation, and it will vary both between individuals, but also it will vary between the disease area that you're working in. In some areas there will be a gene therapy that comes along, and it's the first good treatment option there's ever been for that condition. And in that situation, the decision is very different from one where there are existing treatment options, and you're needing to compare a gene therapy to an existing management regime for that condition that may have good outcomes for some people, may have good outcomes for many people, and then you're having a more complex consideration as a patient to decide, how does this compare to what my existing options are? What are the benefits and what are the unknowns? What are the other things? So I think it's a really difficult patient decision to decide that you want to go down the gene therapy route, because you're deciding to take something that in many cases will be a kind of one-off treatment. There will be unknowns about the long-term impact of it. There will be unknowns about the outcomes. There may well be variability in how effective it can be on an individual level. And so therefore, I think this produces real difficulties for clinicians as well, to kind of communicate to their patient, this is what might be the outcome of this, but we don't know. But if you go down this route, you may not be eligible for future gene therapies. You may then, so it may work very well, but equally it may mean that you're back onto the same situation that you were before, and you go onto other treatments, or it may change your treatment options. I think that's very difficult. Specifically in haemophilia, and this may be true in other conditions as well, is that while a gene therapy may kind of become your main treatment option, it doesn't undo any kind of previous impact that your condition has had. So for example, in haemophilia, many people have joint damage from prior bleeds. And so while a gene therapy may treat their condition and mean that they no longer need to have kind of other treatment options for their haemophilia, they're still going to need they're still going to need social care. They're still going to need support from physiotherapists. So it doesn't kind of replace all your care needs. It changes one aspect of it, and when we still need to consider what support people need more widely. And I think so that's kind of, I guess, the other challenge here is it doesn't remove people from the healthcare system. It just adapts what their needs are and the support that they need.
Thank you, Jeff. And Dan, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. I think kind of service readiness and service disruption has been touched on a couple of times already, and I think gene therapies can very much be seen as disruptive new technologies, but I think we need to not lose sight of the fact that they can potentially offer benefits for rare disease patients and also the health system. So there's potential to reduce burden of treatment, long-term complications, hospital visits, and improve quality of life for these patients as well, once we get over these regulatory and access hurdles. But again, it's been touched on, but we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are uncertainties, so around long-term safety or efficacy, and we just need to keep those in the forefront of our mind when we're assessing these as well.
Wonderful, thank you. I'd like to just throw this open just to make sure we've fully explored that in terms of these concerns that patients might have around these therapies. And Jeff's obviously talked about perhaps concerns around whether it might preclude you from future treatments. Obviously, you've mentioned there, Dan, about efficacy. Do you think there are other concerns that we need to be looking at from an education point of view of, if we're taking this community on the journey? What are the other big concerns that you think maybe we haven't already discussed? If anyone wants to kind of throw any out that we've missed.
I might respond to that. So I think, essentially what Jeff has outlined is the kind of risk appetite for patients and families. How confident or comfortable do they feel about, as Sam says, being the early adopters or kind of joining the kind of next tranche of people. And all of the things that he's described are very true and very real concerns for patients and families and clinicians to think about, what the long-term impacts, the possibility of no access to future treatments, you're one and done. Therefore, our healthcare system is going to put policies in saying, well, if you've had a gene therapy, you're no longer eligible for anything else. Also, the possibility that you may not be eligible for new trials because the gene therapy may have altered your current stage of the disease and the progression of it. So you may not be eligible for new trials. Something I just want to throw in here from a social care perspective that kind of seems to be missing from the dialogue is, a number of these rare disease patients and families may be on benefits. And taking a gene therapy, for example, there may be a perception by the benefit system that these patients are better than they were before the gene therapy. And going back to Jeff's comments about the previous damage that a condition has left the patient with, and the gene therapy not necessarily fixing that, not being able to go back in time, is a real concern, because some patients will potentially be in a position where the social care system and the benefit system might say, well, you've now had this gene therapy, you must be better, therefore you're no longer eligible for some of these benefits and other, elements of support that you're getting, which may be a barrier to patients wanting to access those, because that potentially puts them in a very difficult, challenging social situation. So I think education around the gene therapies needs to be wider in terms of the considerations that patients and families need to consider, because maybe these things aren't things that people are thinking about, but actually the social system might be thinking about these things. Absolutely, there's a change in the healthcare needs, hopefully, for the better, and you're reducing that resource allocation that is needed for the healthcare system, and they can allocate the resource in a different way for different purposes. But actually, the social care system may have a massive impact that needs to be considered, and some patients may be deterred from accessing those treatments because of the implications of that.
And
It's a really
and
important point, isn't it? Yeah. Sorry,
I was going to say, Sheila, it's another example, isn't it, of why almost a bigger whole system approach and a step back to look at, if and we know they are, if gene therapies are now here and part of our future landscape, whether that's treating somebody with an ultra orphan condition, a rare disease where there may be quite a large, prevalent population out there living with a condition, or in future more common diseases, it's got so many points in the health system, social care system, education system, fertility system, that it touches upon. And yet we've tried to start introducing these things in the same way we look at everything else. So trial expectations are the same, regulators' expectations are pretty similar. I think there's been some flex, but pretty similar. And equally with NICE and NHS England, from a reimbursement, defining value, looking at budget impact and what's an acceptable budget impact, all of those things haven't really shifted with any significance. And I guess that's where my concern comes from, because then it's clunky. And if we don't take a step back and look at it as a whole, we're going to miss things, which will mean delays, it will mean no's, it will mean pharmaceutical and biotech companies not investing potentially in the UK. And we're seeing all of those things actually happen already. So treatments that patient organisations hoped would be available to the communities that they serve have not been launched, or are delayed in their launch, or have got no's from NICE.
It goes back a little bit to what Matthew said about the infrastructure always kind of being a step behind, doesn't it? And making sure that things aren't being developed in isolation, and that, if we're investing in this, that the government are also in parallel looking at, is the infrastructure there for benefits, for example, is social care there, is all of that support that's required moving in parallel with these developments, so that that doesn't get left behind and dragging its heels.